Welcome to Whova's Event Insider Panel Discussion Series. My name's Marisa, and I'll be your host. Our Event Insider sessions offer great tips and insights from experienced event professionals on various topics in the event management industry. In today's session, we're discussing how to manage events while short-staffed, with guest speakers Lauren Manson, the Executive Director of the Ohio Health Information Management Association, and Sunny Briscoe, the Deputy Director of the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon. If you're interested in viewing more content for event organizers, subscribe to our channel where you can see more interviews with top event professionals and new content on the latest event industry trends. Now let's get into the discussion. So if you are just joining us, I would like to reintroduce myself. My name is Marisa, and I am the host and your moderator for today's panel. We also ran 3 pre-session poll questions that many of you answered, and we closed the poll just before starting this morning's session. So while we are waiting here to get started, as some more participants are starting to join us slowly, I can go ahead and read some of those poll results for you. So for the first poll question that we asked, which was how many people are on your event organizing team, 61% of respondents chose between 1 and 3 team members, 23% of respondents said between 4 and 6 team members, and 9% said between 7 and 10, and 6% said they have more than 10 team members. The second question asked, have you lost any event organizing team members in the past 12 months? 41% have responded yes, and 59% responded no. Finally, the last poll question asked, how many volunteers do you recruit to help run your event? 22% said they recruit between 1 and 4 volunteers, 22% said between 5 and 8, and 36% said they have more than 8 volunteers to help run their event. And then 19% indicated that they do not have volunteers for their event. These poll responses were really interesting to read this morning before the session, so I really appreciate all of you sharing your thoughts in the polls. With that, we can introduce our speakers in just a minute. We will be touching on the pre-session poll topics during our discussion, and as you all know, the main topic we will focus on during today's panel is managing events with limited staff, and the discussion is going to be covering a variety of key topics on the subject. So I'm really excited to get started with this in just a minute. And with those announcements out of the way, let's just go ahead and introduce our speakers and then begin our discussion. So first, I am very excited to welcome Lauren Manson to the virtual stage. Lauren is joining us from Columbus, Ohio, where she is the Executive Director of the Ohio Health Information Management Association. Lauren, we're so happy to have you on the panel today. Could you please tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Marissa. As Marissa mentioned, I am Lauren Manson, the Executive Director of the Ohio Health Information Management Association, also known as OHIMA. We are an association of 4,000 credentialed health information professionals in Ohio, and I've been in my position for about 10 years. I actually came from the industry side, so I had to learn how to run an association about 10 years ago, but by now I think I have figured it out a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. And next we have Sunny Briscoe joining us from Portland, Oregon, who is the Deputy Director of the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon. Thank you so much for being here, Sunny. I'm going to turn the mic to you so you can introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Marisa. Hi, I'm Sunny Briscoe, Deputy Director for the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon. Very, very long name. So we just go by MHAAO. I've been with MHAAO for 7 years. Have worked on, we have several different things that we do, all things peer support. And so one of the things that we offer is an annual conference called Peerpocalypse, which is why I'm here today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sunny. I'm really excited to hear all that you both have to share about small staff event management. So let's just go ahead and get right into our questions. My first question is, could you all share some details about your recent event? For example, the number of attendees, speakers, days, and sessions of the event, and the amount of staff that you had on your team. And with that, did you ever feel as though there was a lack of staff on your team for the amount of work that needed to be done? Sunny, you can go ahead and start with this question.
Sure. This year, our event was held in March. We had 637 attendees. it was our first hybrid conference. So we had 362 people in person and 275 people participate virtually. We had 42 presenters, 4 keynotes, and 25 exhibitors. So it was actually a pretty big conference for us. It was our largest in history. This is also our 9th year doing this particular conference. Typically, we have it for 4 days, and we have about 10 admin as our team. We start off with 4 people as our core team, and then we have other staff members do some auxiliary functions for the conference. We don't pay for volunteers. We actually have staff volunteers. And so we usually have about 13 to 15 staff members do some volunteer work for us during the conference. And did I ever feel like there was a lack of staff on our team? Oh, of course, all the time.
Well, thank you, Sunny. That is what we're going to be getting into in more detail throughout this discussion. So Lauren, do you want to go ahead and tell us about your event?
Yeah, so our event, our annual conference was also in March. It was hybrid. So we had our in-person conference in mid-March, and the virtual portion of the conference was through May 31st. So it just closed. So we felt like it was a very long conference for the staff to support, of course. We had 1,127 attendees, which was the second highest attended conference in our history, with our first being last year's, which was a fully virtual conference in 2021. We also used Huva for that event. So for the OHIMA 2022 conference, we had 30% of our attendees on site, which was about 300 people, 70%, 800 were virtual. We had 49 different vendors, which added about 100 exhibitors to our on-site count. And then we had 57 speakers. It was a 3-day event with 41 educational sessions total. The first 2 days began with a keynote and then had breakouts the rest of the day. And then the third day was 2 full tracks on HIM specific topics. We have 1.25 FTEs in the OHIMA central office. And then of course, many board members and volunteers with small staff. We have to utilize our board members as staff sometimes. And were we feeling like we were short-staffed? Absolutely. I think that's the nature of hybrid and all large events. You never have enough people. And if you haven't planned a hybrid event, it feels like you're planning 2 separate events. You're in person and then you're virtual, and they are happening concurrently. So I'm still amazed we pulled it off.
Me too. Well, thank you for sharing those details, Lauren. Now that we have more context on both of your events, let's get into some more of our questions. So when you are short on staff, of course, there's times where you're going to have to cut back on certain parts of your event plan to free up capacity for those more critical parts. Could you each share a few examples of things that you've had to cut back on or forego entirely in your event plan? And then how is that decision of what you need to prioritize in that plan made? Lauren, I'm going to turn the mic back to you for this one.
So for our big annual conference, we did cut back, but it wasn't necessarily on the conference. We chose to cut back in other areas of what our association does. For example, some of our smaller events and our online education opportunities that we used to do a lot more of pre-COVID, we cut back on those to allow us enough resources to put on the hybrid event. So Huva, and then we also have a new association management system that helped us, automate and make some of our processes more efficient, which also freed up some of those human resources to work on the hybrid event.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'm excited to hear a little bit more about those processes you automated, and one of my next questions down the road. Thank you for sharing that. Sunny, could you share your thoughts on this question as well?
Yes, of course. So we're short-staffed this year in that midway through the planning year, we had 2 people move to different positions outside of our organization. And so that really did cut into our planning and getting some of those monthly tasks completed. So we did have to make the decision to cut some things for our conference because many of us actually double as event planners, but also doing some other duties within our organization. So we definitely hold a lot of hats, especially as a nonprofit. So some of the things that we decided to cut back on was streaming evening events, because we were doing live streaming at the same time as having in person. So we were holding essentially 2 conferences at the same exact time. So Huvo definitely helped with mitigating some of the things that we had to cut, but that was one thing that we needed to do, was the streaming the evening events, just because it was also our first hybrid conference. And so we wanted to set ourselves up for success instead of failure, and trying to navigate so much at the same time. We also typically do something called pre-conference events, where we hold other workshops the day before the conference starts. And we did decide to cut those this year, again, mostly because it was a hybrid conference for the first time, and just trying to mitigate how much work we were all doing at the same time. And so we decided not to hold our pre-conference events even in person. And one other thing that we just didn't have the capacity for this year is, normally we have like awards, leadership awards that we give out. And we just didn't have the time or the capacity to really get nominations together and do this whole, campaign and marketing tied to that as well, for getting the leadership awards out there. So we had to really focus on what were the must-haves and what were the wants, and really focus on making sure that we're, producing a really great conference with the must-haves. And then if we had time to add the wants, then we went ahead and did that. So there was some discussions on the back end about what we could do with the staff that we had available.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for sharing on that. And my next question actually focuses on those top priority components rather than the ones that you had to cut off. But so for the most important parts of your event, how did you improve efficiency on those things that you were prioritizing? And so could you each share 2 to 3 tips or processes you implemented or tools that you used to save time and improve efficiency within your team? Sunny, I'm going to turn back to you on this one.
Sure. So regardless of whether you're short-staffed for the year or not, I think it's a really good practice to just have regular team meetings with your planning team. Whether that's once a month or twice a month, I think it definitely start off with once a month, and as you get closer to your event, definitely more. We typically move from once a month at the beginning, and then having weekly meetings the closer you get to the event. And then making sure that you create like a calendar of tasks, so that you have all of the things that you need to take care of by month. So we typically start planning 10 months to a year before the event starts. So this year, we as soon as the event ended, we actually went right into planning, because our next year is our 10th year anniversary. So we know it's going to be big. And then when you're, divvying up those tasks per month to make sure you're staying on schedule, assigning those tasks to team members, and checking in regularly to make sure that they're not over capacity, or if they need some assistance, being able to take some other team members and help them accomplish those tasks. So not just, being very rigid in the fact that you're assigning roles or tasks to one person, but being able to work as a team when needed, or to be able to step back and let somebody take ownership over that. I think that's super important to improving your team's efficiency, is communication, and also just being organized as well. As far as for Huva, it was really user-friendly, and also getting some of those tasks met in a really quick way. And not having to try to navigate other systems or software to try to complete the task. Everything with Huvo was very much everything in one place. And so it was just a matter of assigning a task to one person to make sure that was implemented.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that part of your process. Lauren, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so great minds think alike, Sunny, because you say communication. I also say, in addition to that, is documentation. And we also have a giant timeline I call it a timeline. It's an Excel spreadsheet with over 300 tasks of every single little thing that goes into planning the conference, from, like you, Sunny, a year prior, booking the venue, to planning speakers in the agenda, to even little things like adding room assignments to Whova and writing speaker thank you notes, because you have to have it documented, because you can't spend all of your time being reactive instead of proactive. So like you, Sunny, we have this timeline, and we're having, I'm going into this timeline on a weekly basis because I'm the only full-time employee, and, divvying up those tasks between me and my assistant, so that we can really be efficient. Efficiency is one of my favorite topics. So you have to have things documented, because you can't depend on yourself to remember things. And I am not the type of person who does well under stress and pressure. So we do everything possible to reduce that, so we don't have to be stressed and unnecessarily, because yes, everything is stressful, but we don't want to cause additional stress because we're unorganized and don't know what we need to do. So again, I think that timeline is probably one of the top tips that I have. Also, using Whova and your AMS system to, make any of those manual processes more automated, so you don't have to use your human resources on things that you don't have to. And then, how much time did it save? It's probably hours and hours and hours and so much stress. So I definitely say you just have to have everything documented, so at least you know what needs to be done when.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I do want to keep things moving, but my next question is a little bit more specifically about the actual event day. So obviously you get more stress, as you mentioned, and busier, especially nearing the day of and on the day of the actual event, especially when you're on site. So what can you do to prepare ahead of time, specifically to, reduce the need for that on-site manual labor on the event day, especially when you have a lack of staff? Lauren, you can go ahead and take this one.
Yeah, so in addition to our timeline with all of our line items pre-event, we also create schedules for on-site. So as you all know, there's so many moving parts and so many little things that need done, that we create schedules. And I'm not kidding, it's pages and pages long, and it's sometimes minute by minute. My assistant has an item that's 1:05 p.m. go change out the sponsor signage for the break, things like that, because there are things that are definitely going to come up on site, fires that you have to put out, unknowns that you didn't anticipate. And if you're trying to use all your brain power to remember all the little things that about, it's impossible to do it all. So having that schedule not only makes sure that you don't forget things that you need to do, but also allows you to hand off things. So if I have something major that I have to take care of, I can hand off those tasks that I was going to do in the next hour to someone else, so that I can go and take care of that crisis. So again, it's the schedules, and then using your technology to free up those human resources where you can. And I know we're going to talk about specific Whova things here in a little bit, so I won't go into detail on that quite a bit yet.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. Thanks for sharing that advice. And Sunny?
Pretty much the same thing that Lauren mentioned, is making sure you have that schedule. It's super important for the day of. But the other thing I would say is some things that you can do beforehand is having regular meetings with your venue coordinators. So making sure you're checking in with them a few times, to ask specific questions about what your needs are, and making sure that the venue itself has the capacity to fulfill those needs. Especially when you're doing a hybrid conference for the first time. Not all venues have caught up with their technology in supporting hybrid. So making sure that you're able to communicate effectively with them and ask the questions. And if you don't know what the questions are, do some research, Google, and do what questions should I be asking my venue and my venue coordinator, and invite your venue coordinator to some of your meetings. And that way they can absorb some of that information that you're sharing with your team. And it sometimes perks some questions that they have themselves, and hey, what do you mean by this? And what are you expecting from us as a venue, to make sure that that goes off without hitch. So having some of those pre-conference conversations with just the venue staff, and then also with your volunteers, your keynote speakers, your workshop presenters. So having meetings beforehand, sharing what the expectations are, what what they're going to expect when they get to the conference, or what should they have ready before the conference. Allowing them to ask questions, because they definitely have questions. So making sure they feel comfortable so that they're not stressed out when they come to the conference itself, and you're having to you're stressed out, and then you're having to mitigate their stress as well because they feel unprepared. So allowing space and time for all of the folks that are participating in your conference to ask questions and feel comfortable when they get to the conference is really important. And then obviously building in breaks and supports for your team so that they're not feeling overburdened or overwhelmed while they're there, I think is super important as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Sunny. My next question does have to do with Whova, as Lauren gave us a little preview of. So I know that both of you did use Whova for your previous events. And of course, we are all experiencing the Whova virtual event platform right now. Some of us may have used the mobile app as well. But since we're sharing tips on managing events with small staff, I want to talk about how you used Whova for event management purposes. So could each of you name 2 to 3 Whova features that saved your team time in your planning process? And what would you say was your most useful feature in terms of improving efficiency on your team? Sunny, I'm going to turn the mic back to you.
I know this sounds super simple, but right off the bat was the name badges for us. It was very time consuming having to go in and make name badges for people before we had Whova. In this case, we're able to upload all of the registrations because we didn't use Whova for the registration component itself, but to be able to upload names and other information and have those badges populate on their own is amazing. It's like magic. The other really great features of Whova were like the speaker center and profile setup, and not having to, and that's something that we really look forward to trying to incorporate even more this year for 2023 is the speaker center and profile setup, and allowing speakers the freedom to really put the information that we need into the system and not having to do that for them is something that we really look forward to. And the announcements feature. We use that feature so much, and again, being able to communicate effectively with both in-person attendees and virtual attendees was super helpful, and not having to try to figure out how to communicate with everyone all at the same time. So it was just everything in one place. The announcements feature was super, super helpful. And I want to say that just allowing the freedom for conference attendees to create like meetup spaces or meetup times, or to create like chat rooms, that was utilized so much. We had people uploading over 400 photos into the app itself. So it's just so much engagement as a tool. Is really something that helped people feel engaged, whether you were in person or virtual. So
awesome. Thank you, Sunny. And Lauren?
Yes. So reiterating what Sunny says, love the name badge generation, because we used to like be manually applying QR codes to name badges and things like that. So the fact that it would automatically do it is such a time saver. And then we absolutely love the speaker center, exhibitor center, and sponsor center, because having those individuals be able to manage their own profiles and upload their own information was like life-changing. And then finally, my personal favorite is the web page auto generation. And I don't know if I'm calling that the right thing, but where they enter all that information and it pops out HTML that you can just drop in your website, and you have a web page of your agenda, of your speakers, of your exhibitors all ready to go. Not only just that immediate creation, but the fact that it automatically updates every time a speaker, has a new credential that they want added. They can go into their profile, do it, and then it miraculously appears on your webpage. We used to have to manually go to like 16 different places to update one little thing, whether it was something misspelled or a new credential or whatever. Now it just all happens automatically. And in addition to the automatic update, the speaker or the exhibitor can manage it themselves, which we absolutely love. That is just in itself such a time saver. But I mean, taking advantage of technology is just one of my favorite things about, working with events. And when you're short staffed, like you don't have a choice except to take advantage of the technology that you have to like free up those human resources to do what the technology can't. So Love those features. And then of course, how you can like mass communicate with all your exhibitors and all your speakers with one email within the speaker center and the exhibitor center. Love that. I always recommend keeping your prior year's communication, which I think Whova does automatically for you, so that you can, not recreate the wheel every year. You need to send a new email. So love all those features so much. And honestly, those features are one of the reasons we keep coming back to Whova.
Awesome. Thank you both for sharing those tips. My next question is something that both of you guys have kind of touched on already, so I'm really excited to hear you share a little bit more in depth. I do want to shift gears and talk about volunteer staff. So of course, when you're short on staff, volunteers are huge. They are the most important way to support your in-house team. So how many volunteers did each of you hire? What does that look like? Do you have any tips on recruiting and training volunteers? Lauren, do you want to go ahead and start out on this one?
Sure. So we had a lot of volunteers even before COVID. We had about 70 volunteer slots before COVID to run our conference. And, these volunteers do everything from working registration to presiding over breakout sessions to introduce speakers and moderate Q&A. This year, we also had volunteers checking people into sessions for the continuing education credits. So in 2022, that number doubled, and we had 160 volunteer slots at our conference to run the show. And that's just because there's so many moving parts and you need manpower. And when you don't have staff, you have to utilize volunteers. So it does take a lot of staff time to herd the cats. Did I actually say that? I mean, manage the volunteers to do all of this. But my recommendation number one is to your volunteers should be doing things that can be explained in an email or a one-page document. Like they can't be doing complex tasks. Those are the things that you've got to save for your staff. So we, send out instructions for volunteers before the show. And we also have them online in like a volunteer hub so they can access them at any time. And then I also have them on site just in case they need a refresher. And again, it's always like a one-page document, something simple. And then a best practice that we found this year that I wish I would have thought in prior years is we put their volunteer assignments on the back of their name badge. So that has greatly helped with, people knowing where they're supposed to be when is, their time, room, etc. is just on the back of their name badge. And it does take a little bit extra time to like create that sticker, but lifesaver and such a time saver on site. So we do that and that greatly helps. But we definitely have to rely on a lot of volunteers to run our show, but it makes it happen. So, and we are our board volunteers that get waived registration to our annual meeting. We require them to volunteer at least in one capacity. So that's how we recruit a lot of those volunteers. We say, if you're going to get free registration, you have to do something on site. So.
Awesome. And with that, I want to follow up, Lauren. What I know you mentioned, of course, with your volunteers, give them the things that can be written out in the instructions, save the more complex stuff. Could you give a couple examples of like what kind of work this is for your volunteers and what kind of things you avoid having them do?
Yeah, so we have volunteers. They work registration, so they're checking people in, making sure they have their name badges and materials. We have them preside over breakout sessions, so we have at least one volunteer in every breakout room. We call them presiding officers. So they introduce the speaker, moderate Q&A, let staff know if something goes awry in the room and needs attention. We also have staff. We had student volunteers this year checking individuals into sessions so that we knew where people were so we could issue continuing education credits after the fact. We have volunteers working our OHIMA booth. So we have a booth for our association in the exhibit hall, and volunteers, usually board members who are a little bit more senior, work the booth. So they can answer questions, and a lot of times there are questions like, where do we go? Like, where's this room? So we make sure that they have, a venue map and can work Whova easily so they can instruct anyone that comes up to the booth.
Awesome. I appreciate you sharing those details on that. Sunny, do you want to talk about your experience with volunteers?
Sure. It's pretty similar to what Lauren has shared. Again, I think that one of the big differences that we do is is having trainings beforehand. So making sure that volunteers know what their duties are, allowing questions and us answering those questions. And then other thing is if they have, and making sure there's a training on technology, especially now since hybrid seems to be the direction a lot of conferences are going, or navigating virtual still. Technology is a huge thing that we just want to make sure that your volunteers know how to navigate technology or are comfortable navigating technology. And again, allowing questions for that as well. Some of the types of work that our volunteers do, again, we have mostly staff volunteers on top of our core team, is, checking in, attendees, supporting presenters with Zoom technology and presentations. We call them room hosts or virtual hosts. We actually have 2 per workshop for, supporting the in-person component and then supporting the virtual component. So we do assign 2 people per workshop. Setting up special event rooms with supplies, unloading and loading up supplies before and after the conference. And then we also provide something called peer support at our conference because it is a leadership conference for peer support specialists. So we definitely have a wellness room component. Some things I think that are not great fits for like volunteers in general are just like logistical questions that your core team is really going to have those answers for. So making sure to communicate to your volunteers if there's any complex questions, here are the people to direct them to. I love the idea of what Lauren shared about having a schedule behind their badges. I'm totally going to steal that for next year because I think that's the main problem that we have is like tracking them down to make sure that they're for their assigned, volunteer activity. So some of the other things is that wouldn't fit or like managing social media or making sure that photos are getting posted. Addressing any changes to the agenda. Those are things that should fall to your core team and making sure your volunteers know that, hey, if there's any questions about these things, direct them to us. And then the other thing I would say that is actually really important is evaluations. So you can have your room hosts support the process by making sure to announce, hey, make sure to do the evaluations. But as far as communicating and sending out reminders about evaluations, that should fall to your core team. And evaluations are a super important component for any event planner because that helps you learn what you could have done better and really inspires innovation to make sure that your next conference is even better and, bringing takeaways from that conference and learning from that conference. So, but not just from your personal experience, but from the attendees as well. So the evaluation part, you can have volunteers help, but it's really up to the core team to make sure that those evaluations are going out and sending out reminders and collecting that data so that you're able to apply some of those things to the next conference.
Awesome.
I totally agree on that point, Sunny, is the evaluations. It's so key. If you see something recurring on the evaluation, that's something you need to look at. And we also do the evaluations for speakers and exhibitors too, because they always have great ideas that we didn't think of, or, something that we thought was a smooth transition that they didn't. So totally agree.
And there's outside of that evaluation, just to add a little bit more to that, if you're able to partner with a volunteer that specializes in evaluation and data and research, use them. We have one that we've actually been able to work with over the past 3 years. And so we do the evaluation specific for each of the workshops, but we also have a conference-wide evaluation. And so this partner that we have actually comes in and does the, pulls all the data and sends out a unique evaluation for the conference as a whole. And they also go as far as to set up peer-to-peer interviews so that they supply the questions, but they're actually asking peers to ask these questions of each other and are able to really have these dialogues that are very organic, but you learn a lot from them. So if you're able to get a volunteer like that, for sure utilize them. But it's a very unique skill set, and it's not just something that you hand to just anyone.
Yeah, that's really useful. Thank you, Sunny, for sharing on that. I want to shift back from volunteers to talk about your in-house team, just to hear about your process for internal coordination. So, of course, it would be ideal always to have one person really managing and handling each aspect of your event plan, but oftentimes, as all of us would likely agree there's not really the capacity to designate one person to each part of your event plan. So how do you divide your responsibility within your team to maximize productivity? And if there's any tools that you adopt for better coordination, you can share those as well. I'm gonna turn back to you on this one, Sunny.
I think some of the tools that we definitely use are, again, using those monthly meetings and gearing up towards the conference. But delegation and communication are definitely some things that you want to use. Delegating to certain staff members, and don't be afraid to take it back and assign it to someone else, but being very clear in that communication with your team. So if somebody has more than one task assigned to them, because you will have that with a smaller team. I delegate based on the skill set as much as possible. So if somebody's super organized, then I have them usually work on the hotels and the registration, which are two big jobs by themselves. So I try not to overburden that person by assigning them more things to do. I try to spread the love to as many of our staff members as have capacity. So again, I shared that we had like 4 people in our core team, and then we have an additional 6 people that we have as auxiliary, helping with auxiliary functions. So if I'm able to take some of the assignments and assign them to some of the auxiliary staff that are helping with the planning, then that really frees up time for the core team to actually do other components that are as important, but maybe they only have that skill set or time to do. So it's really about delegating based on skills and time, capacity. And then again, going back to that, if you have a huge project, being able to work with smaller teams. So for example, sponsorship is a really important component of conference organization. And that's not going to just fall on one person, or it should not. So for example, on our side, we have our development coordinator, our marketing coordinator, our executive director, and myself that'll be working on that this next year. So that's shared among 4 people because it's such a large component to our conference. So that's something that's it's not going to get done if you just assign it to one person, because they're not going to have all the information that certain people have. So our development coordinator needs to work in conjunction with our marketing coordinator to make sure that everything's presented in a very eye-catching way. And the marketing coordinator, of course, will have some feedback for the development coordinator as well. Any information presented is really relied on information that we get from our executive director and myself. So it's just very much like creating these subcommittees or smaller teams to carry out larger projects, but also delegating based on skills and capacity.
Awesome. Yeah, Sunny, I actually want to follow up with you on this one. I know you mentioned your evaluation process after, but when we spoke last week, you talked about how your debriefing session is really critical for adjusting these planning processes for the next event, and how that's kind of, the starting point for your planning process and dividing the work. Do you want to share a little bit more on that?
Of course, thank you for the reminder. So with the debrief, there's a couple times you can actually hold a debrief. You can have it right after the conference is over, which I highly suggest, because everybody's excited because they just completed the conference and they have all of these ideas and they're excited to implement them into the next year. So you have that debrief with your core team, and ask the questions, like just encourage them to write notes throughout the conference if they're so inclined. Some people are just like, no, there's just way too much going on right now, I have to hold off on that. And there's some that are like, I'm gonna shout out to my marketing manager, but he had about 6 pages of notes after the conference ended of things that we could try to do better next year. And some people would be like, I'm so offended by that, but I wasn't. I was like, yes, let's do that and go through those 6 pages of notes as a team. And we did. So we shared it as a Google Doc, and the team read through it before we had our debrief, and they added their notes to the Google Doc as well. And then a lot of the notes were, pretty similar, and some of them went into more detail than others. But I think it was a very bonding experience with the team as a whole, but also you took away so many things that you wanted to implement into the next year, and it causes excitement for the team to be like, yeah, it's going to be even that much better. The evaluations are a different component. So with our community partner that we've partnered with over the last 3 years, they actually come up with a report. So they came up with a 15-page report of all of their findings. And so that was another opportunity for us to read through that report and then debrief about that report and the findings itself. So the debrief right after the conference is super important to gather all your thoughts and suggestions for the next year. But then having another debrief based off of the evaluation itself and the evaluation findings is super important, because it brings up certain topics that you might not have caught as event organizers, because you're looking at certain components of logistical aspect of itself, but not necessarily the content. The evaluation definitely captures the content of your conference. And so you're able to really expand or improve on the content itself based off the feedback from your presenters, from your workshop attendees, from your keynote speakers. And they're able to really help you improve the content so that people keep coming the next year.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing more on that. Lauren, do you want to respond to this question as well?
Yes. Well, and Sunny, I totally agree with you with, jotting down those notes during the event. I know there's a lot going on, but I carry a little pad of sticky notes around with me. And even if it's just a few words, at least that's going to trigger my thought of what it was that I need to do, even if it's something as simple as something that I need to add to the schedule for next year, because it was something that we need to confirm or check, etc. I always come home with so many, or I come home and I have 50 emails from myself in my inbox of these random notes, but at least I have them written down so I don't forget them. And then we also have a debrief afterwards, which is so helpful because every staff person, volunteer, etc. has a different perspective or maybe saw something different during the conference. So we bring all those thoughts together and write them down. But with the event planning process, I have a fabulous assistant and another contractor that, works on the meeting, and we all work from home. So email is our primary form of communication, and you really have to find whatever tool works for you to communicate and be accountable. And my team is very good about, once I hand something off, I am confident that it will either be done, or if it's not able to be done or there's a roadblock, they will communicate back with me. So that is extremely helpful. And being able to hand off full things to get it off my plate, since we only have 2 staff members and 1 contractor that works a few hours a month, being able to hand a task off completely is really the only way that we can get things done. So when I choose what I'm handing off to my assistant, it's something that I can hand off completely and then it's off my plate. So for example, I gave her all of the marketing e-blasts for the conference. What I did in the beginning was create a little schedule of these are the high level times and what should be in each e-blast that needs to go out. And I handed that off to her completely in the beginning of the year. And then she actually found times in the year that were quieter. So for example, our conference is in March. So January through March is the busy time. So December is the calm before the storm. It's also a holiday month, so it's a little quieter. And she took the month of December to create all those e-blasts ahead of time. And she would just create them. She'd write all the verbiage, all the graphics, and then just send me the final test for review. And then right before it was time to actually send them out, we would review them really quick, tweak them a little bit, and then send them. So that's something that really helps us, is we take advantage of those quiet times of year that we can do every little thing that we can to even prepare something that will later be finalized and done, because there's just way too many tasks to happen during those busy times to actually get done. So we're always working way ahead of the game just for the sake of our sanity.
That's great. Thank you, Lauren. We do have a couple more questions here, but I do want to remind all of our participants that we're going to be shifting into the Q&A soon. So if you haven't asked your questions yet, please do so in the Q&A function, which is on, again, the right side of your screen. But I do want to get to these last couple of questions before we move into the audience Q&A. So my next question has to do with a trend that has really affected the event industry in recent years. Event venues have been hit really hard by the Great Resignation, resulting in less reliable services oftentimes. So what would your advice be on handling unpredictable situations that affect the quality of service you can offer your attendees on site? Lauren, I'm going to turn the mic back to you on this one.
So we did notice on site that they were short-staffed, which of course results in lower quality and things being forgotten. So sometimes there's not much that we can do personally about the venue being short-staffed, but what I did to sort of accommodate that is on my schedule, I put a lot more checks to make sure that things were being done. So for example, if I have something specific for a session on the BEO, banquet event order, I have a check on my schedule to make sure it's actually there, because then I can tell the staff at the venue if it's not, and they can get it done ahead of time instead of scrambling when the speaker tells you that it's not there. Or even reviewing the breaks and the meal times to make sure that everything that's supposed to be out is out. Not only that it's set up, but every little thing. And then those reminders and just touching base with the venue staff to ensure that everything that is supposed to be accomplished is actually accomplished. So reminders in my schedule. Once again, documentation.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren and Sunny.
I think I touched on this a little bit beforehand, but making sure that you're having regular meetings with your venue staff. And so there should always be like a coordinator that you're working closely with. And not only the coordinator, but also the caterer. So having regular meetings with them, talking about what their capacity is, because most of the time they'll tell you upfront if they have capacity to support whatever you're trying to do or if they don't, which allows you the opportunity to really focus on that and making sure that's covered during your event. One thing that we did kind of have a hard time navigating was the technology piece. We thought that they were able to support certain functions for a hybrid, and then when we got there on site on the day of, we discovered they didn't. So that was a really big surprise that we didn't really appreciate, but not because they were trying to be malicious or just not sharing the information. It's just that they were communicating in a different way that we were. And so it's just kind of some confusion or miscommunication happened. And so we just had to pivot really quickly to try to fix that component in order to be able to carry off our hybrid. So just asking questions. It's okay to ask questions multiple times in different ways to make sure that you're actually getting your questions answered. So that's what I would suggest is like, don't just ask the question once and be like, okay, it's resolved. Like, go on site, tour the venue, ask questions there that you had already asked via email or phone. Because one person may say yes, and then the person who's actually doing the work, like the AV folks, will say no, that's not possible. So when you get to your venue, ask to speak to the AV folks, ask to speak to the chef, ask to speak to the folks that are going to be changing your rooms, and say, hey, is this possible? How much time do you need to make it possible, if at all? For example, like if you have a bigger conference, a lot of times conference centers use a room in multiple functions. So for example, your banquet room, the room that you're eating your lunches or your meals in, sometimes they have an overflow room, right? That you can break down a wall and expand the room to hold more people. If you're using that room for your workshops as well, you need to allow time between the workshop ending and the time that the caterers need to set up for lunch or meals. So being able to ask the questions based off of your agenda. So if we have 700 people, does the banquet hall hold 700 people without changing any rooms? And if the answer is no, and then the next question is like, how much time do you need to set up for the meals if we're using these two rooms, which is what their overflow is? Then they'll say if they need an hour, then you definitely need to take a look at your agenda and make some adjustments. So asking questions in person, virtually, inviting them to meetings, and just making sure that you're getting your needs met. And don't be afraid to ask in different ways, because forms of communication, people are comfortable with more direct questions and people are comfortable with more indirect questions. So just being able to communicate effectively in different ways so that you get your needs met.
Awesome. Yeah.
And Sunny, I have one comment on that is, definitely when you're visiting the venue, check and see if they have something set up in the way that you're going to have it set up, especially for live streams and AV, because we were very new to that. So I said, can I come see something that's being live streamed? And they're usually very accommodating. And then I asked, can I see the end result of the live stream? And they're like, oh, well, that's private information. And I was like, oh, well, I'll just email the association. They'll probably share it. And it was another meeting planner. I'm like, this is what I'm having trouble with. Do you mind sharing or letting me know your experience? And she sent me this incredibly long email and said, this, it was great. Here's what it was. And here's what the end result was. And most people are very willing to share. So I know if someone emailed me with a specific question, I would respond back, just knowing that I've been in that situation. So
yeah, that communication is super key. I appreciate you guys touching on that. I do want to get to this very last question before we shift into our live audience Q&A. Sunny, I'm going to direct this to you. I know you kind of touched on this earlier, but going back to that so-called Great Resignation, how was your internal team affected by this? I know a lot of people are facing that struggle of losing team members right now. So what would your advice for event organizers who may have to deal with this in the future be? And kind of how do you see the situation improving? Sunny, you can go ahead first, and then Lauren, if you want to jump in as well, feel free.
Sure. So yes, we did lose some staff members midway through the conference planning year. One was a person who was really in charge of the registration and hotels, and the other person was in charge of marketing. So two large components of our conference. So definitely having to pivot and making sure that we already had systems in place to gather that kind of information. So it wasn't such a huge hit because we were able to still have everything running smoothly, except there were some components when it came to marketing that has to happen consistently. And so I think my suggestions are that monthly calendar of tasks, making sure you're keeping up with it. So checking off things that are completed and making sure you have clear assignments so that there's no miscommunication on who's handling what. If for whatever reason, I think one key takeaway that I wish we had incorporated in the past was what Lauren was saying. When you have your downtime, making sure you're scheduling things in advance so that if somebody does leave, that you're not, kind of hung up in the fact that that didn't get done. And so now you're trying to manage it yourself as consistently as you're able to, which is not going to be consistent at all. But if you're able to get like your social media posts scheduled in advance, your e-blast scheduled in advance, that really does help with mitigating some of the effects of somebody leaving all of a sudden. Of course, having content up and fresh and up to date is really important. So having those kinds of things scheduled maybe a couple months in advance is how I would recommend as far as you would go, because a lot of things do change during the planning process. But it does give you 2 months of content that you weren't going to be able to pull off yourself. So that's an example of like the marketing component and not being able to have somebody who's there day to day. But just making sure you're keeping up with your tasks, checking them off, and will really mitigate some of that backtracking to figure out who did what. And it is regards to like, do I see the situation improving? Yes, already it's improving. With regards to like the pandemic, for example, and turnover is always going to happen. So I think putting in systems in place to really address that turnover in case it does happen is just a good practice going forward in general. I did not do that at the time. And so it was really like a 4-month period of really having to pivot from my daily tasks as the deputy director and then switching over to the logistical stuff for the conference itself. It's not sustainable. And I had to pull in other folks from other departments to help, which again, they were very gracious and were willing to help, but it's not sustainable in the long run. So I think just a willingness to pivot and adjust your agenda is also necessary, like cutting some things are not as essential as others. But I do think the situation is improving overall. It's just making sure you have systems in place to account for the unknown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it, Sunny. Lauren, do you have anything you want to add to this before we jump in?
totally agree with everything Sunny said. Just one point is, making sure that you have all your procedures and processes documented. Like we have a whole hub of procedures on how to do some of the basic tasks of our organization, so that when you are training staff, you're not having to create the procedures and train the staff. You already have those in place so that you're ready to go, and you can just hand it off, walk them through it a few times, and then they can use it for reference. So we, again, use our downtime to do things like that, just to ensure that everything is documented, since we are such a small staff and we only have 1.25 FTEs.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. You guys have shared a tremendous amount of advice already, but I do want to make sure we can get to some of those live audience questions that I'm seeing a bunch of here in the Q&A box. So without wasting any more time, let's just go ahead and get right into those questions. Our first one is from Valerie, who asked, how can we ensure that all aspects of events are taken care of so that things don't fall through the cracks until the last minute? I know this is something you guys have touched on throughout the discussion, but does someone want to kind of jump in and address this first?
Yeah, I can say that again. It goes back to that timeline. You can't make sure everything gets done if you don't know what everything is that needs to get done. So you've got to get it documented first, so that you know what, when, and who's responsible for it, in order to get all the moving parts done, because there are so many moving parts.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to keep moving here to this next question, which is from Renee. Is there a particular number of organizers you recommend in relationship to the number of sessions? Do either of you guys have an idea on this that you'd like to share?
I think really kind of sketching out your agenda would be super helpful for that. So how many breakout sessions do you plan on having? Are you planning on having a keynote session? How many sessions or concurrent sessions throughout the day do you plan on having? Are you going to have evening events? So take your full agenda and then decide on, do you want one person to assist in the room, or do you want two? And then that'll help you determine how many volunteers you need for your event. As far as the planning component, how many team members you need as part of your planning team, again, take your list that Lauren and I keep talking about and decide how much work is needed, and then divvy it up from there. And if you need to bring on volunteers, then you can bring up volunteers, again, with specific skill sets. If you don't go through your event list or through your agenda, you're not going to know what kind of skills you need to implement in your, or to have in your team or your volunteers. So really taking a look at your agenda and your schedule for the year, and coming up with that number and the skills is really important.
Thank you, Sunny. Our next question is from Mike, which asks, what budget are you working with when you have limited staff? So did you need to bring in specialists to deliver aspects of the event, for example, AV? Does someone want to touch on this?
So we did bring in some extra contractors, like for the actual event. Like I had an AV person on site, because we had the live streams going, and I know the basics, but I'm not an AV person. So he handled all the live streams. He was fabulous, and best money we ever spent. We definitely will bring him back. But then also we depended on our volunteers. But it's not, unfortunately, like, a lot of it is, in an ideal world, yeah, I need more staff, but we don't have it. So we have to make what we have work, and, bring in that AV person for the actual event. We can't afford him the rest of the year, but at least he can be on site, and we can have like 1 or 2 pre-event meetings with him to ensure that we're having all of our bases covered.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. I'm going to keep moving here. We have a lot of questions. We're probably not going to be able to get to all of them today. Do either of you want to share on this question from Tony, which asks, what app or program do you use for your event timeline?
So it's just Excel. It's a big Excel with 300 line items, and we can keep it in a central location.
Awesome. And Sunny, what program do you use?
Same thing, Excel. We may have started on Excel. We also use Google Doc for certain things, but using Google Sheets is more an effective way to make sure everybody has access to it. And so we do use Google Sheets and Google Docs just to make sure that everybody has access, and then effectively communicate as well in our monthly meetings about that. So No special app.
All right, thank you guys. Our next question is from Tanya. What are the aspects that are vital in selecting a venue for a hybrid event? How do you know how many people to expect in person versus virtual? So since you both had a hybrid event, if either of you want to kind of share on this, it's kind of a loaded question.
I was just going to say that is a loaded question that is so hard to answer. People kept asking me, what do you expect on site? And it's like, your guess is as good as mine. I would share the comparison of where we were registration numbers compared to prior years, like percentage wise, and that sort of helped us gauge what to expect. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, we had all of our contracts written pre-COVID, so those were what they were. So we were just dealing with trying to get as many people on site to accommodate those pre-COVID contracts. And unfortunately, contracts for the future are so hard to write because there are so many unknowns. We're having a lot of discussions with our board and in a strategic planning about what to do for future contracts. But if you have any sage advice, I would love it. So send it my way because I don't think anybody knows.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. We are about to hit the hour mark. There is one question that has a lot of votes here at the top of our list. It asks if Lauren and Sunny are willing to share a generic template of their Whova task list. I will defer this to you if you guys want to jump back into the Q&A after the session and share this. It's completely up to you. I just wanted to kind of flag that since it did have a lot of votes. But we are about to hit the hour mark, so unfortunately we do have to wrap up. But I really appreciate all of these wonderful questions asked by our participants. And Lauren and Sunny, of course, I can't thank you enough for joining on today's panel and sharing all of your experiences with all of us. And again, thank you to all of our participants for joining and listening to our wonderful speakers today, as well as asking such great questions. It was really a pleasure hosting all of you. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you found this panel helpful, subscribe to our channel to find more videos just like this. You can check out the other topics we have featured in the Event Insider series and more content for event planners. See you next time.